Welcome to RavenPack's 7th Annual Research Symposium, this year titled Generation AI, the New Data-Driven Investor. My name is Armando Gonzalez. I'm the CEO and co-founder of RavenPack, and I will be your host during today's very exciting event. I want to thank our amazing crowd for joining us this year. We got close to the 1,000 mark in terms of registration. But unfortunately, we can only fit 300 guests in this room. But it's, I think, a great example of the excitement in the data space, specifically in AI and big data. I want to, first of all, thank our friends and sponsors, WorldQuant, one of the world's most sophisticated asset management firms, and also a gold standard when it comes to quantitative investing. Our friends at RStudio, they're a developer of free and open source tools for the R programming language, and they also sell professional or enterprise-ready solutions. Our business partners for over 10 years, Dow Jones, I want to thank them for their continuous support. They're definitely a pillar in the industry when it comes to news and analytics. And finally, 2IQ, a leading global insider transaction data provider, and a very well-established alternative data vendor in the space. So once again, thank you to our sponsors for helping us make this event possible. We have some excellent speakers today. We have representatives from firms including WorldQuant, Deutsche, Merrill, Battlefin, Citi. We've got folks joining us from NYU, from Battle of the Quants, so the Wall Street Journal. So it's a very diverse crowd. Many of them are presenting proprietary research, so that's going to be interesting. And we have some amazing panel discussions en route for you. I'm going to start just by giving you a quick introduction, as I said, just to set the stage for what we're hoping to learn and some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves. And the first one is big data a big opportunity or a big problem? And I don't expect you to answer it now, but keep it in the back of your mind as you're starting to listen to some of the presenters, and more importantly, as you start to hear about some of the latest research and some of the thoughts of our excellent speakers today. But I also thought another question to ask would be, when do you think the notion of big data actually emerged? Now, would you say it was probably during the dot-com era, like early 2000s? Yeah, or maybe during the emergence of the internet in the 90s? Or going as far back as like 1960s when centralized computing became important? Well, I was actually able to trace it back to the late 1800s. And the US Constitution actually called for a census to be conducted every 10 years. And the idea was to basically count the number of people, as well as probably horses and cows and anything that could help the government plan better. And it used to take almost 8 years to do a census. About half of the time was just collecting the data, and the other half just counting the census information. So the US Census Department said, we need a better solution. And they issued a RFP, a request for proposal, somebody to come up with a solution to address the census problem. They thought that by 1890, they would be unable to finish the census that was necessary. So by the time that they completed the census, the next one would be up, and it would be impossible to have the numbers ready. So an employee of the Census Department came up with this idea. And it was inspired by some of the punch cards that were used in trains just to track when people were traveling. And he figured, why not encode this census data on a punch card? And he came up with a machine that would allow for it to not only record or encode this information in the card, so an operator would take the card, create holes that would encode where certain numbers, based on counting people, as I said, or anything that they were looking to count. And it would then be placed in a reader that had all these pins. And underneath, there was a layer of liquid mercury. So whenever they made contact through these holes, it would send an electrical charge over to a counter. And that counter would continue to move as it counted things that were in these cards. So it became a very efficient way of encoding information that was collected into something machine readable. And then it was basically fed into this machine that produced all these numbers. Eventually, you could take that punch cord and store it in a little compartment and they had some basic rules, whether it's people or horses, these go in here. So it was another way of sorting. It was like one of the first data storage devices. But it was a good example of the first big data problem. We had a problem to count, and we were facing a real challenge. It would be impossible to perform this task. And Herman Hollerith came up with this solution that solved this big data problem. And it's an important point in history because it essentially created the first machine that would eventually become part of a company that solved insurance problems, business problems, and more importantly, it became part of the companies that became IBM. So this was an example of the first sort of storage device that was invented. There's another point in history which is interesting, and that is the economic boom of the 1920s. And the same factors that were contributing to the economic explosion back then were also contributing to the big data problem, or the explosion in information, or the information overload that we would experience over the next 100 years. For starters, the government opted for laissez-faire approaches. That is, they weren't intervening in business, they had lower taxes, they expected businesses to flow and grow without government intervention. And this led to the creation of new industries. The assembly line concept was introduced, the Model T, so that we had vehicles now. We also had credit, the concept of credit, where people could actually buy cars on credit. I think it was like 6 out of 10 automobiles back then were bought by credit. The expansion in knowledge, lots of research and studies were being published. So we were growing more and more information and knowledge that had to be essentially recorded in libraries and in other areas. But we also had a significant boom in production. And in the production of raw materials, whether it was crude and oil, and this was still fueling more and more industrialization. And part of that led to the concept of advertising in a sense. People didn't really know that they needed certain things, so businesses started investing in advertising. And back then it was all print, but if you connect it to today, you can see how big the advertising industry became, especially with the digital era. But this was already happening 100 years ago, right? So with advertising, with consumerism, with new devices, radios, telephones, refrigerators, all these devices were creating what we now know as the Internet of Things, right? Or data that would eventually be connected somehow through these devices, contributing to this massive overloaded information. So back then, with all this new data that we didn't know would happen, we started basically creating a big data problem. And we would start developing computers and ways of storing it better ways of addressing it and analyzing it. But it was really, I think, with the World Wide Web that we saw a significant amplification of the big data problem. Now, basically anybody could produce data and share data. And as we got into the year 2000, we started thinking about the problem. Gardner came up with probably the more famous description or term, the big data's 3 V's, right? Volume, velocity, and variety. So we started thinking about it as big data. In response to that, I think Amazon came out with Amazon Web Services, probably before its time, but already thinking about how are we going to deal with storage, how are we going to deal with computing. So all these new companies start to emerge. Of course, RavenPack is born in 2003. But just like RavenPack, other companies were already thinking about this problem. And we were looking at it from a more unstructured data perspective, knowing that 80 to 90% of the world's data was unstructured. So that was going to become a problem, and it certainly needed a solution. And as we saw the big data problem emerge and no solutions to be found yet, we saw more contributions to the data or the information overload. Social networking became very common. People started sharing messages, photos, files, all sorts of content. The iPhone and other smartphone devices came to light, and those contributed to the creation of more and more information. So the information overload problem would continue on during the 21st century, and we would start to become aware that we are no longer in control of data, that we no longer have a solution to this massive overflow. And it got to the point, I believe, specifically with the US election, where we realized that, hey, you can actually use technology to understand voters, you can actually use technology to understand societies, and big data can have an influence both in the political as well as the social route that we take. And it took a few years to understand that, and I think specifically this year in 2018, I'm calling it the awakening, where we find out through the Cambridge Analytica data scandal, through new regulation like GDPR, where we're becoming more aware of the value of data and the importance of understanding the information that we own, the information about us, the information that others have about us, that we say, hey, it's time to do something about it. Right? And we're living in a world where companies have significant control over data. We're living in a world where I'm calling it the birth of the alicorns. These are, I think unicorns are companies that are worth $1 billion. Now we have companies that are worth $1 trillion. So alicorns are unicorns with wings, right? And these companies have so much data in comparison to everybody else, and they know so much about us. Whether they have the technology or the tools to make sense of it is a different thing, but they have access to big data like nobody else does. So I call this the awakening. I think it's extremely important to understand the value and importance of big data and understand that big data is required in order to have real AI. Artificial intelligence without data will never happen. And we still haven't solved the problem of big data and information overload. We're also at a time where we have the haves and the have-no data, right? We have people that have access, we have companies that have access to information, and others that are simply disconnected from this network. Don't have control over their personal data, don't have control over their Facebook data or their LinkedIn networking, they don't have access to their own credit records. It's other companies that control it and have it. And I think it's time for us to think about that and think about how we can retain and regain control over that information. So this revolution will not only be about technology, but it will also be a social revolution in terms of information. And then finally, I think on a positive note, that this is an opportunity for us to address some of our own cognitive biases, to address some of our own limitations, in that if we embrace technology or we give it an opportunity to both understand the information that is available about us and embrace AI as a way of addressing some of these biases or some of the social differences, perhaps this is a way for us to evolve on a more positive path.
This is RavenPack.